Ok, pa samo lepo pozdravljeni, da ste danes prišli na dogodek, ki obeležuje Mednarodni dan palestinskih zapornikov, ki je bil 17. aprila. Lepo pozdravljeni v imenu Gibanja za pravice Palestincev in bi jaz dala zdaj kar lepo mikrofon Kristini, ki bo tudi napovedala goste, pa zdaj bo naprej govorila v angleščini.
Thank you, Barbara. So yeah, it's a great honor and privilege, and I'm really happy that we have a chance to somehow commemorate with a few days delay International Day of Palestinian Prisoners. And today we will be talking about prisons as tools of apartheid and colonialism. And we have two great speakers with us. From Ramallah is joining us Basil Farraj from University in Berzeit. He's a researcher who focuses on memory, prisoners, survival in prisons, and also resistance. And on my right, Majd Nasrallah from Kalansoa, Palestine 48, also with a lot of experiences in community organizing, a researcher himself, currently I think a student at the University of Ljubljana. So it's a pleasure to have you both here tonight. And maybe just to give a feeling, I think from the beginning of April, the numbers say that there are around 9,600 Palestinian prisoners. And since 1967, 1 million Palestinians have been imprisoned and detained. 3,532 are in administrative detention, which means that they don't know what they're charged of and they don't know how long they're going to be in prison. 342 are children, 84 are women, and 111 are serving life sentences, which also somehow touches upon the latest developments when Israel has decided to pass a new law that also enables it to carry out death penalties for prisoners in West Bank, but also in Israel, mostly targeting Palestinians with the definition as it is in the law. I would like to start perhaps, Basil, with you. You have written in 2023, after genocide started in Gaza, when Israel was not allowing, not even the International Red Cross, to visit the prisoners, that International Cross was somehow letting down the Palestinian prisoners. And that doesn't seem to be something new, because it seems that Palestine has been let down by international community, international organizations for a long time. And I would just like to perhaps ask you, do you see that since then, has the situation changed? Do you feel that anyone is taking more note or fulfilling their roles and obligations?
Thanks, Kristina, and good to be with you, albeit virtually, and with Majd. And thanks for organizing this event, of course, to commemorate Palestinian Prisoners' Day. Has the situation developed since, and how did it develop, and where are we currently? I think so, just to give the audience kind of a sense of why was it important to to note that Israel has restricted and in fact denied visitations by the International Committee for the Red Cross. Now, since the genocide began, so in October 2023, Israel embarked on multifaceted methods and modes of violence and torture to kind of convert the Israeli prisons, where, as you correctly mentioned, Kristina, now around 9,600 are held in Israeli detention. But of course, recent estimates tell us that Israel had detained around 23,000 over the past 2 years and a half alone. So 23,000 since the genocide began. Now, with this, with the onset of the genocide, what this Zionist regime did is converting, in a sense, Israeli prisons, this entire network of detention centers, of interrogation centers, of prisons, literally into a war zone, in which Palestinians were receiving an or were, in a sense, living under a regime of escalated violence and torture. And of course, this violence included multiple manifestations. For instance, embarking on a systematic starvation campaign, reducing the amount of food that prisoners are able to consume on a daily basis. We have had testimonies of prisoners telling us that they would receive only 8 to 10 slices of bread a day, one spoon of jam per week, very bad quality food and very minimum amount of food that actually led to numerous, if not all, prisoners losing their weight. We've seen the images of the prisoners being released kind of in a very frail and fragile and weakened state. Of course, this is in addition to a systematic denial of medical care, beating, sexual assault, harassment. And one of those kind of modes of violence was to isolate prisoners, to effectively transform their cells, their detention cells, into another layered space of isolation and confinement, where prisoners were telling us, released prisoners specifically, that some of them had to spend, for instance, 6 months in that small cell, not being able to leave the cell at all during the day, at all for numerous months. And those prisoners, of course, what the reality they described is, this kind of fortification of isolation. And a part of that isolation is, and I'm going back to your question now, Kristina, is the denial of family visitations. So since October 7th until today, so we're talking about 2 years and a half, the Israeli prison service, the Israeli government, of course, and the racist minister, of course, they're all racist, of course, but Ben Gvir specifically embarked on a campaign as well to deny any right for Palestinians to be able to see their loved ones, to see their families. So we're talking about a situation where prisoners were entirely put in a total state of confinement, total state of isolation. They were cut off from the outside world, from their families. And a part of that is denying and negating the rights to visitations to the International Committee for the Red Cross, to the ICRC. This has not changed, actually. So since the genocide until today, prisoners are still in that space of total isolation. They're not able to communicate with the outside world. Of course, imagine for the audience here, this is not only the reality. The reality is this state of isolation, this inability to communicate with, not only with the outside world, but actually, in fact, to communicate with prisoners inside the same ward or in the cells adjacent to them. Some of the prisoners also told me, the released prisoners, that if the guards see them speaking to other cells from another, to other prisoners from another cells, they would be receiving a punishment. And I'll stop here maybe after just this note. In addition to this, because we're talking about this kind of sense of isolation, of course, the ICRC is a part of it. But in addition to this, and this is a real change inside Israeli prisons, the Israeli prison service drew a yellow line in the courtyard where prisoners were previously allowed to walk. And this yellow line, the prisoners are not able to step outside of it. So imagine a space where, the prisoners naturally would be able to leave their cells, to walk, to speak to each other. This space itself, already a confined space, already a small space, is marked now by a yellow line. And let's just remember the yellow line that Israel also put in place in the Gaza Strip, a yellow line where prisoners are not allowed to reach it. They're not allowed to step over it. And there's a similar line inside their cells, where if any prisoner dares or mistakenly reaches that line, they would be facing severe punishment. So I think the question about the ICRC is important, but it also tells us something about this kind of entire reality of isolation under which prisoners have been effectively forcibly placed. And I think the intention behind that, the intention behind continuing this kind of this reality, is to prevent prisoners from not only communicating with people and their community outside the prison cells, but also perhaps an attempt to break their morale and to break their humanity. And I can stop here, Kristina. We can take this later on.
Can I just ask you, is there any symbolism in the yellow line?
Perhaps actually, because some of the checkpoints across the West Bank, they have different colors. So the checkpoints dividing certain villages and the checkpoints that prevent Palestinians from crossing, for example, from area B to areas under total Israeli control, there are actually similarly in a yellow line. They have used different colors, of course, so orange, for example, but I'm not sure what the yellow itself resembles, but I think the symbol is actually perhaps a barricading effect of the communities that Palestinians live under, whether it is inside the prisons or inside this kind of carcerized locations across the West Bank. So I think it brings to mind kind of this, this fragmenting, this constant gaze, this constant surveillance that Israel has effectively put in place, not only inside the prisons, of course, because, if we think about the yellow line, as I mentioned, the Gaza Strip is a perfect example. If we think about Lebanon now, for example, how Israel has controlled these territories and drawn kind of different barriers and segments, I think it's definitely a physical but also a symbolic barrier that Israel attempts to instill in Palestinian minds, and of course those in other parts in Lebanon and other parts of the Arab world as well.
Okay. As you were speaking, probably something that's quite clear to many came to mind, that yellow was also the yellow star.
Definitely. And of course, the Nazi regime did similar lines in their concentration camps.
Majd, when we talked some time ago, you were mentioning also the system that Israel somehow enacted after 48, after Nakba, of breaking the Palestinians who stayed in Palestine 48, so on the territory that it pronounced as Israel. And I'm wondering, how does this, what is now more and more called carceral system, how does this affect your experience, or how did it affect your experience growing up? Was it because violence is also very direct in Israel? What does prison bring in the system where there is this very strong wish to present itself as a democratic state where everybody has the same rights, just that some have a bit less of them, and only, as you say, if they live their identities at home. So if they stop being Palestinians, they can actually reach certain institutions, positions, and so I'm wondering, because it was mentioned, this fragmentized situation, isolation, what has it brought to Palestinians in 48?
Thank you, Kristina. Thank you all for being here. If you'll allow me to answer the question in perhaps an indirect, have an indirect approach. But before that, I do have to admit that indeed this is a very, very strong topic for me today. This is, when we talk about prisoners, this is not something that is easy to kind of navigate through, because we are talking about one of the most atrocious systems of, brutal degradation that Palestinians are going through today. And as you mentioned, these, thousands of Palestinians in detention centers, we're also talking about almost 90 deaths, that go unaccounted for, and those are the ones that are verified. And, we have zero kind of access to Israeli detention centers or prisons to be able to even investigate what's going on besides what we see. As Basil mentioned, there's very limited access, even by lawyers or families, to the prisoners. However, I think it is very important to premise the conversation. There's a lot of, there's talk here and there sometimes that these are actions by an extremist Israeli government. right? That these are, these are the policies somehow of only these figureheads, Ben Gvir or Netanyahu and so on. And I think it's very important to, first of all, put that hoax or expose it. No, we're talking about a whole system, a system that dehumanizes Palestinians, a system that dehumanizes the other, and a system that, if I'm allowed to speak freely, psychopathic. We're talking more than 90% of Israelis support the genocide of Palestinians, right? And we're talking about even, upwards of 50% of Israelis that live alongside these quote unquote Palestinian citizens of Israel also wish that they were not there. And as such, it's really important to begin with that, to begin to understand that, no, we're not dealing with just, the fringes of a system or these extremist forms that apartheid or colonialism is taking, but this is at the core of, it's on steroids now. But the fact remains that this is not something that begun during the genocide, but it only became more brutal with genocide. And just like any colonial project, the ambitions of Israel, the first ambition, which we see via the death penalty law, is the elimination of the local population. That is their optimal objective. And when they're unable to, fully do that, as they couldn't in Nakba, and so until today, their next best option is to the best degree, capacitate, to hold hostage, Palestinians, and prisoners being the most extreme form, but Palestinians at large are held hostage. It's just like you said, it's a carceral system that doesn't differentiate, right? And this kind of incarceration is not only physical, right? This is an incarceration that's also part of the molding of identity, part of the molding of the spirit of Palestinians, right? So these prisons also exist in our heads as much as they exist in reality. And to speak on in juxtaposition to the Palestinian citizens, for those who don't know, there's 20% of Israeli society are Palestinians who remained after Nakba, who face an array of discriminatory laws, right? Whether it's in land or urban planning, job opportunities, education, and the list goes on. And I think it's also important to mention one other thing. When we talk about Israeli society, we assume that there's a normative state, but the fact of the matter is, in my opinion, it's just one big military outpost. And if you look at the composition of Israeli society, you will see that it's actually just an amalgamation of these different races, ethnicities, and so on. We're talking, almost 1 million Russians, Ethiopians, Ashkenazi Jews. 53% of the society is actually Arab, Mizrahi Jews, right? These are, descendants of Jews from Yemen or Iraq or Syria and so on. But when we come back to the topic of today, excuse me. When we come back to the topic of today, I think it's important to highlight that one of the biggest differences, right, is the fact that we have, citizenship. We're unlike people in the West Bank, we're not subject to the military rule of the IDF, but we're, supposedly subject to civic law. Now, where that starts to bleed out is Israel's use of different instruments, legal instruments, to subvert this status of citizenship, right? And, using, if you look at the death penalty law, by the way, 3 of the 90 Palestinians that were killed, 3 were Palestinian citizens of Israel. And when we start looking, when we look at the death penalty law, while it mainly targets Palestinians in the West Bank, there are provisions that allow this to happen to Arab citizens, right? Non-Jews. And this provision is if the attack negates the, if it if it negates the Jewishness of Israel. And here we come into what's even more complex, right? When we talk about stripping of these rights of citizens, is the use of instruments like the counterterrorism law, right? And terrorism in this definition is such a broad and undefined concept, which means anybody could potentially be a target of the death penalty. I don't know if you recall, but a relative of mine, my cousin, in late 2024, was driving a truck, ran into a group of Israeli soldiers, and was assassinated on the spot. Now, if we kind of take that situation and try to analyze an accident, let's assume there was an accident, car driving, and it was a Palestinian, had an accident, ran over or, killed an Israeli, you could potentially be liable to the death penalty. And, perhaps we can, go deeper into that. But I think to go back to the question, it's, when it comes to Palestinians in Israel, yes, the fragility is, or not the fragility, but the paradigm of this binary is, on the one hand, yes, we're used as a card to, to say this is a democratic state. These folks can vote and so on, at the expense of us not identifying with our Palestinianness. But on the flip side, we're non-Jews, based on, if you look at Israel's Declaration of Independence or all its basic laws, rights stem from your Jewishness. They don't stem from your status as a citizen. And, their approach to prisoners is just one more example of how we are the other, we are the enemy, and citizenship becomes such a frail concept that can easily be taken from you. I mean, they also passed the revocation of citizenship law just not too long ago, which gives the Israeli government the ability to revoke the citizenship of Palestinians who are indicted of acts of terrorism. And an act of terrorism, by the way, if you look at another law, the consumption of terrorist content, you could be considered a terrorist for liking a post on social media. And so I think I present this to you to show that these prisons sometimes are also prisons of the mind, right? The citizenship card is not something that protects us. While it's true that, Palestinian prisoners do not go to IDF prisons, but as security prisoners, they are, almost subject to the same inhumane treatment.
Okay, thank you much, Basil. I would let's go a bit deeper down into the depression and somehow the system that's created to imprison people, it seems. And if I understand correctly, this is also something you're looking at, talking about legal genocide, how to, if I understand correctly, make genocide legal. And I'm wondering, how do you perceive somehow, and I'll say our understanding of this, what you live? So because we still have the privilege of somehow looking at it. And for me, it was interesting to see, how many Palestinians have been talking about carceral system existing not just in prisons, but in the whole of Palestine. And we've seen Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese picking this up. Now, you mentioned legal genocide. She has also mentioned in the last years that Israel basically is abusing humanitarian law and its provisions to somehow present this vision or image of legality for its crimes. And it seems that with the law on death penalty, or the death penalty bill, we also see exactly what also Majd mentioned. So we've seen in the last 2.5 years a really high number of people being killed in Israeli prisons, obviously illegally, like murders. Yet now it seems that Israel has somehow taken care that this is going to be legal. So I'm wondering, I mean, how do you perceive, how fast are we catching up? And is it important to catch up or to somehow break out of this system that you also mentioned is actually an export item for Israel to offer also to other states to more and more imprison their populations?
Yeah, thanks, Kristina. There's definitely an obsession, in my understanding, of an obsession by the Zionist regime with kind of discourses of legality. Now, this is not to say that, of course, what's being done is legal, but there is constantly this attempt, in a sense, to present the Israeli actions as adhering to the law. As I mean, Majd already described some of the racist laws that Israel has put in place, whether it is the basic law Israel for the Jewish people, whether it is the ways in which, and this is something very important also, the ways in which Israeli courts actually decide on banning prisoners from receiving lawyer visits, for example, or kind of legal decisions that legalize torture. So, for example, there's the 1999 High Court of Justice ruling. Again, this is way before, the attempt to legalize the death penalty. We're talking about a law that actually came following different kind of committees and commissions. So there was an instance in 1987, it's referred to as the Landau Commission, that kind of, in a sense, reframed torture into terms such as moderate physical pressure. And as I say this, of course, you might recall, for example, enhanced interrogation techniques put in place by the United States Army during the quote-unquote war on terror in Iraq or in Abu Ghraib or in Iraq and Guantanamo. So in a sense, there's this obsession, I think, not only, of course, not only with Israel, but in general, I think with the colonial mindset, there's obsession to present the actions as abiding by international law, abiding by certain norms. And if not, there's this kind of attempt to in a sense, whitewash the crimes through discourses of legality. So, for example, Majd already mentioned the categorization of security prisoners. The Israeli prison service and the Israeli, of course, broadly, the government, does not perceive Palestinian prisoners as political prisoners, nor does it perceive them as prisoners of war. There's a different categorization that the Israeli prison service had put in place. It's absurd. It's the security prisoner, which already by itself makes a differentiation between Palestinian political prisoners and what they refer to as criminal prisoners or Jewish prisoners in that matter. And both are actually subject to different categories of law. So you have the military courts that are subject to a vast array of military orders that have been put in place since the beginning of the occupation in Palestine until this moment, that the Israeli occupation forces and their courts can modify and can put in place different codes to regulate the Palestinian population, to control our civic and political conduct, while, of course, this stands in contrast to civil law that I think Majd kind of alluded to, where the majority of Israelis, and here Jewish subjects, so people who are granted not only nationality but also I think but are granted rights as well as subjects of the state, are prosecuted under. So in a sense, there is this kind of this obsession by the Zionist regime to present its actions as aligning with international law, or at least as aligning with norms. And if that fails, and here I just want, we don't have to remember this because we know it very well, but if that fails, the battle is always presented as a battle between barbarians and a civilized people. So, and of course, this brings to discourse, how the Zionist regime kind of attempted to justify its actions across the Gaza Strip, this genocidal level of violence that has been unleashed, kind of the destruction of hospitals, of educational institutions. It was always done in a sense, the logic was in the eyes of the Zionist regime is that we are, defending our state, we are defending public security, that there are military personnel present in these situations, and that's not allowed under international law. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, Israel, of course, has continuously been trying to kind of reframe its conduct as abiding with a certain sense of legality, while we know that Israel not only kind of manipulates the law, but it actually dictates how these laws functions. They always function along racial lines. I think what Majd already described is an perfect example of that. What does it mean to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel? It's very different than an Israeli Jewish settler, for example. A Palestinian residing in the West Bank is treated differently than a Jewish settler who resides very close to our cities in the West Bank, because they're subject to different sets of laws. And I think Israel uses the law, in a sense, to ensure that this kind of racializing and colonial discourse and practice is continuously propagated, and that it defines the levels of violence that are continuously used against the Palestinian people. And the prison is simply an iteration of that. If we look at, as I mentioned before, kind of the distinction between civil and military courts, for example, if we look at the death penalty law that Majd described, and how it kind of, it's directed towards those, quote unquote, who commit crimes with a nationalistic purpose. And that means, Palestinians who are resisting the occupation, for example. So in a sense, very similar to torture. Torture is legalized in the Israeli kind of system, but it's always presented as, an attempt to protect the state and its people from an imminent threat. And I think, just to go back to your last part of the question, Kristina, this is not different than other kind of colonial and violent contexts. However, what's unique, I think, here is that Israel functions as a central node in these kind of practices. What we witnessed in Guantanamo, for example, or kind of the United States kind of explanation for the use of torture was, in a sense, borrowed from Israel. The ways in which the United States kind of confined different cities and villages in Iraq was similarly borrowed from Israeli practices in the West Bank during the Intifada, for example. So what I'm trying to say is that Israel is a pioneer in these practices. It's a pioneer in kind of doing this kind of legal recourse to legality to justify violence and torture. And what's very, I think, violent is that it is exporting this, of course, to other parts of the world where we see kind of this increased criminalization of certain segments of populations. And of course, it's exporting alongside this its weapons, its surveillance technologies that are all used, in a sense, to ensure that populations worldwide are controlled, confined, and subject to brutal levels of violence and torture, in a sense mirroring the Palestinian experience today and in the past as well.
Thank you. Majd, would you like to respond to any of this?
I mean, maybe not respond, but reflect back on and build upon. Yeah, when it comes to international law, and Israel's abiding or non-abiding by it, I think even the days where Israel has tried to maneuver its way around or to find, these justifications using legal language, I think those are behind us. I think Israel today really does not care. And I think there's this global sense of utter impunity, which is allowing it to further further exacerbate these practices, because it sees very clearly that there is no form of accountability held at all. And so I think to the Israelis, I think, the international law arena is no longer as relevant as it was. In fact, I think they are very well aware of the fact that, global public opinion has already shifted. I think the Israelis are very well aware of that. And I think now they're switching more firmly, from the discussion of legality, international law, into a discussion of moralization and, anti-Semitism and, trying to hold the world hostage to these kinds of moralizing narratives and discourses, which I also think they don't, at the end of the day, Israel in its very, in its very formative, elemental kind of presence, acknowledges that it's there by might and by force. These are, some of the earliest founding principles of the State of Israel, right? That they have to be a military force that establishes itself as such. Now, my point earlier about, Palestinianness, whether, on whatever side of the lines that they drew, and the hoax of citizenship for Palestinians inside of Israel, is that, at the end of the day, they will do whatever is necessary to treat us as the other. Whether we're in the West Bank or Gaza or East, Jerusalem, wherever you might be, and whatever kind of legal paradigm that you're subject to, as under military rule, martial rule, or in civic, in civic circles, or civic structures. At the end of the day, they will find ways to strip you of that, right? And one of the tools that one of the practices that they have is these constant amendments to the rules that they, or to the legislations that they pass, right? So they will say that this is a temporary measure for 2 years, right? For instance, the Israeli law when it comes to detainees, Palestinian detainees with citizenship, is that they can take you 48 hours. They could without resort to a lawyer. Today, it's almost 96 hours and almost up to 35 days without any providing any evidence for why you're detained. They're also pushing, they've made amendments to the counterterrorism law that says that they can also conduct hearings without you being present. As a citizen now I'm talking, right? So there can literally be a hearing in your case without you being there, right? So these are one of the many kind of and to me these are like the legal maneuvers. To them, I think to the Israelis, the language of law is more relevant internally to them, right? It's like they're kind of like making this theatrics for themselves, where they try to manipulate and subvert their own legal language to justify the actions that they take. But it's constant. Like, I think one of the most used methods is this temporary, right? They will say, oh, this is only for 2 years, and then they will push it some more and push it some more. And the counterterrorism law is it's since the early 2000s, and it got amended in 2008, and then again in 2016, and then again in 2022. And yeah, so it comes to show you, I think, in my opinion, legality is more an internal theatrical play than it that they're interested in, as opposed to it being a global. I mean, that's not to say that they don't care anymore. I'm just, I assume, or my reading of the situation is that, yeah, it's less important to them at this point. And I think American imperialism and this entire kind of dismissal of international law is giving them so much breath to continue these practices.
Yeah, it seems repression is the main message that. And I will be happy to somehow also give the floor to the people listening here in our room. But I would just like to somehow throw to both of you also the question that you're also working on or researching, and that's the question of resistance, and whether that's hunger strikes, whether that's art. Last year, we were hosting in Slovenia also Mohamed Sabaneh, and hopefully we will soon have his graphic novel that was made based on his experience in prison, Power Born of Dreams, also in Slovenian. So although it seems depressive, and although it seems the system is somehow never ending and ever evolving, and yes, brutal with every day more, also the resistance of the Palestinians seems not to give way. And I'm wondering, how do you experience that, or what does this world look like, and why is it important?
Yeah, thanks, Kristina. Of course, I mean, we described a little bit, perhaps, of what we hear and know about the situation of prisoners today, which is truly a very, a violent and brutal reality. While, of course, I have to emphasize here that this is not novel, of course. Israeli violence and torture has constantly been systematic. So if we look at the history of the Palestinian prisoners movement, we would always see that Israel has put in place, different methods and modes of violence since its early beginnings, to be honest. And of course, if we look even more back, we would see kind of a mirroring of these practices through the British colonial mandate. We mentioned the death penalty, and Kristina, I'll get to your question in a second, but just to contextualize kind of the violence. We mentioned the death penalty, for example, but the British colonial mandate had made recourse to execution of detainees and prisoners who were parts of resistance practices. Now, I say this because Palestinian history, and specifically Palestinian prisoners' history, has always taught us that in the face of brutal violence and torture, there's always kind of these multiple and varied responses and confrontation practices that attempt not only to change the reality of confinement, and I'll give you some examples now in a second, but perhaps most importantly, to assert the political nature of Palestinian imprisonment, meaning that through these different practices that prisoners have put in place, such as, for example, hunger strikes. In 1970, I'll give you an example here. One of the earliest hunger strikes in 1970, one of the demands was to, in addition, of course, to asking for access for pens and for notebooks, was to stop addressing jailers with the term, "Yes, sir." Prisoners in the 70s and the early 60s were forced, since the beginning of the occupation, were forced to address their jailer with, this kind of degrading way, "Yes, captain," or "Yes, sir." And one of the early hunger strikes was an attempt actually to break away from that. During that hunger strike in 1970, the Palestinian prisoners movement had its first martyr, Abdul Qadir Abu al-Fahim, who actually was force-fed by the Israeli authorities. He was force-fed using a tube that later led to his death on the hospital, on his bed, inside captivity, of course. And I mentioned this because, if we look at Palestinian history, we see different moments of resistance. So we'd see hunger strikes, dozens of them. We would see attempts to boycott the military court system that I tried to describe to you, where, for example, administrative detainees decided to collectively stop going to courts that Majd described, because they view these courts as an instrument of this Zionist regime. It's a facade of a court. It's a kangaroo court. We witnessed, for example, the smuggling of letters, of literature, the creation of what we refer to as Palestinian prison literature. We witnessed the smuggling of sperm, for example. We witnessed the transformation of prisons into kind of this very political and social and cultural environment where detainees and prisoners underwent education. They received their MA degrees. Some of them received their BA, their bachelor degrees as well. And of course, not to mention, of course, other examples such as smuggling of cell phones, smuggling of photos, of letters, trying to kind of break the state of isolation that the carceral regime has put them under. And I mentioned this story to say that, historically, there has always been resistance. And in 1970, the example I gave you about the hunger strike, the testimonies I received from people, from detainees who were released from the Gaza, from prisons who were from the Gaza Strip, they told me that the guards were asking them in interrogation to address them as "Yes, captain." And it made me think about that early hunger strike in 1970. In a sense, Israel is returning that kind of mentality, which has never escaped, of course. I'm not saying it's different. It's not novel at all. It's a continuation of the violence. But they really did try to break kind of the sense of the communal imprisonment experience. Now, this is not a cause for despair, I think, and I'll end with two examples to tell you why. While there's this kind of escalating levels of violence and torture, while we know that at least 89 Palestinian detainees, prisoners have been martyred inside Israeli prisons. And I say at least because we do not know the fate of dozens of other prisoners. Why we know that, we have not been able to communicate with the prisoners for the past 2 years and a half. We also see and we know that these prisoners are continuously trying to devise modes of confrontation and resistance with the means available. Now, this is not to romanticize their experiences. The reality is very brutal. We are talking about a war that is killing actually prisoners. When prisoners who are leaving prisons, they're telling us that they have escaped death. And these are the terms that they use. They are in a space of confinement that mirrors, a death experience. The denial of food, the denial of medical care, the sexual assault, the constant beatings, the degrading treatment. However, I think that, because of this history, because the Palestinian prisoners community has always been able to kind of confront the carceral regime, I think that, it will definitely be able to kind of resist this reality. I'm certain that we would be able to see what has occurred, for example, in the early 60s, in the late 60s, in the prison regime. I just want to end with 2 examples of resistance practices that are, that might appear as something as very kind of routine or normal, but in my understanding, they tell us something. Now, the first one of the prisoners who was actually released as part of an exchange deal in October, so the last exchange deal in October 2025, he spent 22 years in Israeli prisons in one term. He was sentenced more than that, but the exchange agreement released him, basically. He was telling me about the conditions of confinement, kind of the degrading treatment. He told me that the guards made, and this is the terms he used, they were playing bowling with them, with their bodies, throwing them across the room, adding soap on the ground and converting cups into kind of bowling balls. And they were throwing their bodies as if they're playing, a bowling party. And he described it as a bowling party, basically. As he was describing this and describing this brutal reality of having prisoners being forced to assault each other or to bark as dogs, he tells me that he had the best, he had the best gift of his life. And then he describes this gift. This gift was that his comrades, specifically 3 of them, in the midst of kind of this systematic starvation campaign, they collected the handful of bread that was granted to them. They collected the jam, the spoon of jam that was provided to them once a week, and they made a cake. And this cake was provided to him for his birthday. And he, as he was telling me the story, he started kind of being emotionally kind of course impacted. I was too as well, but I was thinking that he describes this most important and most precious gift he has ever received in his 22 years. He doesn't know anything actually about life outside prisons. And this gift itself, in my understanding, I think in his understanding and in our collective understanding, is a testament that the will to resist, the will to struggle did not end. And this is the intention of the Israeli regime. It is to break that kind of fighting spirit inside the Israeli prison, to tell us that, that you have no way of living, to bring the prisoners and us outside prisons as well into that near-death experience where you think that it's not possible to resist. And I think that cake is an example to that. And another example that I'll end with, again, very minimal, perhaps very daily, is that prisoners told me, for example, that they would try to steal moments away from the prison, from the guards when they're not looking. They would use their bread to make a chessboard. Again, the small amount of bread that's provided to them to make a chessboard, or they would use the cardboard through which food is delivered to make cards to play with. And I think, while it's just one iteration of confrontation, I think it tells us something. It tells us that, prisoners are, specifically Palestinian prisoners, are living in this brutal reality. But I think that the Israeli colonial project did not succeed in dismantling what a Palestinian prisoners movement means. And I think that's why, of course, we are commemorating this day today. But more importantly, this is why the prisoners movement will continue to play a central role in our struggle for liberation, because it is through this kind of their experiences, whether it's Walid Daqqa or other prisoners, that we are continuously taught what does it mean to think and to work towards freedom and liberation. And I think we would be able to understand what freedom means when we look at the experiences of political prisoners today and historically as well. Maybe I'll end with this, Kristina.
Thank you. Majd?
I mean, I think there's multiple dimensions or components to the question. But to begin with, to stay in line with the plight of prisoners, as I said earlier about, this Israeli obsession with degrading Palestinian bodies, right? We're talking, Ben Gvir, someone like, he ran his entire campaign on not giving food to prisoners, right? These are things they boast about, right? And we're talking, I really get goosebumps when we talk about torture camps and when we talk about dogs being trained to rape. I don't think any of us really have processed yet or sat with what that means, right? And when we say that these are, these incidents that we know of such extreme, I would call it devilish practices, what is it that remains unseen? I think is even more extreme. When we talk about these degradation, I think what the Israelis are trying to do on the one hand, right, is to, I'm sure many of you saw one of those accused of the gang rape that happened in camera was heralded as a national hero. He was presented on the television stations and so on. And I think so I say this to say that on the one hand, this projects their impotence, Israeli impotence to quell the spirit of Palestinians to resist. They believe that, this is one of the few things that they think they have as a colonial power, which is to degrade the body of the Palestinian. And in doing so, what they aim to also do is project to the rest of the Palestinians that the price of resistance is so costly, right? That that you're better off not doing it for your own sake. And they also try to enforce that. I mean, if we look at, for example, they do also, you mentioned Marwan Barghouti at one point, it was, they think that by projecting these images of degrading, political leaders, they can also somehow break the morale of Palestinians. And they, other things like, they would only, I'm sure you also know that there's so many Palestinian dead prisoners whose bodies remain in captivity because they fear celebratory events when the Palestinians are, sent to be, to proper burial. And they also limit, for example, how many people can come to that burial procession. And I think from one pragmatic view, this does have an influence. Let's actually face that. And I think in the absence of an organized political liberation project that is able to uphold and protect Palestinians, it becomes very, many people will feel fear from doing so as isolated incidents. Yani, let's also, bring into perspective other things like the role of the Palestinian Authority in this, who now also no longer affiliates itself and no longer takes care of the families of these prisoners. And they are also, they're playing the role of prison guard against Palestinians. And that's just a fact. And so they are attempting to create this very costly, for lack of a better word, reality in which Palestinians avoid any acts that might even show resistance. I mean, there's a kid from the town across from my town. He's a medical student, and he has zero political activity besides going to the mosque and being involved, in these religious processions. And I'm not sure what he must have said, but the police came to raid his house, and he's still detained because they found terrorist content. And what is that terrorist content? It's war video games. I'm serious. And he's unable to even meet with his parents and his lawyers. And what they use this to make a case for the rest of those around him, that it's something, it's for your better interest not to do it. Now, I recall, something that both Basil and Aboud mentioned when they were here about sumud, about resistance is existence. So we can also bring it back to this idea that, as I said, their optimal goal is to eliminate us, right? And so I think by the mere fact that we exist, in some capacity, that is a form of resistance. But I think in the stage that we're at right now, so long as us Palestinians, on the one hand, have yet to develop a kind of a new political umbrella and new organizational modes that allow us to look out for each other, many Palestinians will feel less inclined, in a sense, to carry out acts of resistance that are more militant, because it's important to note as well that Israel, also instrumentalizes the idea of punishing the collective. And so if you are convicted of, say, a militant attack against Jews, they will destroy your family's home, your home. If you are a sympathizer, in our case, they will revoke your citizenship and so on. But I think, like on the baseline, us being there is a form of resistance, but so long as we don't have, as Palestinians, as I said, new organizational outlooks to how resistance looks to us, but more importantly, on the other hand, absolutely no protection, legal protection or solidarity, I might say, by the world, then this remains only a Palestinian burden to carry. Right. And I think this is something, worth kind of highlighting today, that a big part of the deterrence to such practices, comes from international solidarity that is practical, that is technical. And we don't have that today. So, yeah, but I think, resistance, you mentioned things like, artistic expressions and so on. I think there's also, when we look at the mode of the political mode of the world as a capitalist, this mega capitalist culture around the world, we can also see how much of our artistic expressions can be compromised, in a sense where many Palestinians, and this is a tangent and a tangent, but many Palestinians as artists find themselves in such a difficult position where they're unable to receive funding because no funding will go to producing art that portrays, values of resistance. So there's no livelihood, and many of them are forced to kind of remain in this position where they produce art, symbolic art, like the key, or these traditional manifestations, so that they can sell them. Which is not to say doesn't take away from the value of it, but I'm saying that this attack against resistance is not just by the Israeli security apparatus, but it's something also, it's a coordinated attack also by institutions, by foundations, by different political parties. And so there's this constellation of different actors that make it very, very difficult for Palestinians to express resistance besides existing at the moment.
Thank you. Any questions? And we will ask for, to use the microphone because so that also Basil can hear. I'm sure there are some. No comments? Yes, Nada has one. Okay, go.
Yeah, this is for Basil. I just wanted to ask you if you could comment on something I read in one of your articles, in which you say that administrative detention is a form of psychological warfare. Could you expand on that? Thank you.
Should I go now?
Maybe let's take this one, and then yes, I think more people will gather courage.
Yeah. So I mean, the reason why we could think about administrative detention as, psychological, let's say, form of violence is that it places, so just to give a sense to people here who don't know this policy is dates back to the British colonial mandate, specifically the emergency defense regulations, and it's used to arbitrarily detain Palestinians without charging them or putting them to trial. And the nature of this policy is placing administrative detainees, so Palestinian detainees, in a constant cycle of detention. So, for example, let's say a detainee would receive 6 months detention order, again, without knowing why. It's always under the pretext of what's referred to as a security file. So the detainee does not know why he was arrested in the first place. But add to that, not knowing, of course, when he might be released. And there's a cycle of kind of extensions of these detention orders, always premised with the logic that, detaining this person is essential, quote, to protect the public order and security. And I think that sense itself, so not knowing why you are arrested, of course, not being prosecuted or presented to courts, albeit, of course, these kind of illegal courts that have a conviction rate of almost 99%, and not knowing when you might be released, so there's no end line for the release, places detainees in this kind of constant, I think, psychological torture, if you might say, where their families have no idea why they are arrested, their families have no idea when they might be released. And I must tell you, of course, from the families I know, that being placed under administrative detention is really a psychological experience, because the families keep asking about the release date. It's never known, so it renews after renews. There's no logic. This is the logic of it. And just to add here that this is not the only practice that's being used. Of course, Israel created another category that they refer to, another policy. It's the unlawful combatants law. And think about the terms, unlawful combatant. So a combatant who's unlawful. It doesn't make sense, of course. But and it's used to detain Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. So specifically, actually, during the genocide, most of the detainees have been arrested under this policy, but also detainees, for example, from Lebanon or from Syria. And it's a similar logic. So it places detainees in this perpetual, arbitrary cycle of detention, where you do not know, you have no release date in sight. And I think this places detainees in this kind of constant stress, of course, of not knowing when they might be released. And of course, during the genocide, this has witnessed an escalation to the use of this practice, of course, over the past 2 years and a half.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Could you also say something about children prisoners, and specifically in the context of unchilding, as another Shalhoub Kevorkian put it?
Maj, do you want to get that, or?
And their legal status and so on.
Maybe I'll build on your input, your insight.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, it's very similar. So Israel has continuously used the practice of detaining children as a cornerstone, actually, to what Majd was discussing. So which is trying to kind of dissuade Palestinians from resisting the occupation, or actually detaining our minds or shaping how we think. Historically, of course, children have been prosecuted as young as 12 years old. I'll just give you an example from military orders. So if a child is caught throwing a stone at a military vehicle, for example, he might be or she might be detained for up to 10 years. This is just an example, of course. Now we have other cases of Palestinian detainees, child detainees, who were such as the case of Majdom Nasrallah, for example, who was detained as a child. The Israeli courts waited until he reached, quote unquote, a legal age to be persecuted, and then he was sentenced. But he was a child, he was 14 years old. And that, of course, is a practice across the board where Israel detains children. And of course, it's not, there's no crime. And again, I say the crime here with a sense that does not, of course, it's not a crime to be a Palestinian, but Israel treats children as criminals. And I think it's not just to arrest them. And this is where the second part of your question, so unchilding, it's not just to detain them. It's, to create this experience, this violent experience of raiding a house at 4 o'clock in the morning, for example, of taking a child who's barely 11 or 12 years old, taking them into interrogation without having their family members. In some cases, they might allow for a father to be present, but very rare cases. And, subjecting them to this brutal experience that I think has a purpose beyond simply detaining a child, which is to teach the family, to teach the community that the Israeli army is there, that children have to kind of, it's a very brutal practice, of course. It's a fascist practice, but it's an attempt to in a sense, to break this childhood, to re-engineer this childhood into a very violent notion, a very violent reality. And of course, I'll end with this perhaps, it extends beyond the prison as well, because we have to look at the broader context. So the same child who might be arrested actually faces military harassments by military soldiers at checkpoints. He's denied the ability to go to his school, for example. He is continuously prosecuted by Israeli armies or by settlers, those people who live around settlements. Or he witnesses, actually, imagine this, a child who witnesses the full scale of Israeli violence, killing a person in front of him, or children who see, the ramifications of the genocide with their eyes in the Gaza Strip. So I think this is entirely part of a broader practice through which Israel has been trying to kind of, to dismantle our Palestinian communities through targeting children specifically. And of course, during this genocide, we see an uptick in this practice as well.
Maybe I'll just highlight the last note that Basil made, which is, to Israelis, there's no such thing as a Palestinian child. There is no concept of a child. Contrarily, and you will hear this not only from the social circles, but also from the political echelons that no, kill them young. That's the whole concept. I mean, if you look at Gaza is 50% youth. They're under the age of 18. And if you look at the biggest majority of those killed during the genocide and remain to be annihilated are children. You have so many documented cases of Israeli soldiers shooting babies in the head, multiple times. And so, for the Israeli society, that is something that is actually it's an objective. It's not a byproduct, and so it's not, they don't even use this premise of throwing rocks, or they don't need these excuses. And furthermore, they use these children or the cases such as throwing the rocks to also punish the parents and the families, and to cut, for example, citizens, Palestinian with citizenship, they will cut off the child's welfare. And they will block so much of their opportunities growing up to go into to the workforce or to education, academia, and so on. They will constantly be harassed. So to make it short, Israelis don't perceive children. They have no such notion of that. And contrarily, they to them it's an objective to destroy that. You said unchilding, but it's to destroy young Palestinian life.
Any more questions, comments?
I also wonder about female prisoners. How many are there, and are they treated any different?
No, they're not treated any differently. The exact number, actually, I don't know now. I'll check now as we speak. but they're not treated any differently. I mean, what I described to you, basically the violence that has been unleashed inside Israeli prisons. It has, since the genocide, it has been exactly actually mirrored in the female prisoner sections. And actually, the interviews I conducted with some of our colleagues and comrades and former prisoners describe actually very, very brutal reality where. And this is across the board. It's not just, of course, female prisoners, but where prisoners are subject to a strip search every time they enter the prison, a detention center, or where there's a transportation from a prison to another prison. They're subject to strip search. In fact, actually, some of the detainees also told us that they were sexually harassed. And again, this is across the board, by the way. It's male and female prisoners. So no, I don't think. I mean, they're not treated any differently. Israel has systematically targeted female prisoners. The situation in Israeli female prisons is very, very similar to the reality that has been unleashed across male Palestinian prisoners. And just to note here very quickly that. Since I'm working on this, I mean, I have been working on this for a while, of course, but now we're doing kind of collecting testimonies. It's very clear that Israel has, intentionally converted the reality inside all of its prisons, whether it's male, children, female prisoners, with the intention of using the utmost and most brutal force against this segment of the population, I think to dismantle the Palestinian prisoners movement and to continue kind of the propagation of the war inside Israeli prisons. And just here to say, I just looked up the number. The current, I mean, based on current statistics, so in April, the number of female Palestinian prisoners is 84.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Comments, perhaps? Yeah.
Can I?
Okay, and then, yeah.
I just want to add one line, which is, as we said, how in prisons there's so much that we don't know because we don't have access to the realities. And as much as there's really like a substantial amount of evidence that points to sexual abuse of male prisoners, but also female prisoners. But I think here what I wanted to share is that perhaps it's a bit more difficult to uncover these stories as well, because there's also perhaps an element of shame that many female Palestinian prisoners might feel. And that these harassments do not only occur in prisons, but daily on checkpoints. We know stories of these soldiers who constantly harass women, primarily in places like Hebron, Khalil, where the checkpoints are inside the city. And so, yeah, so it's not just in prisons that this occurs, but also, it's a systematic routine thing that happens outside of on checkpoints. And I also wanted to note that percentages of sexual abuse and rape inside Israeli society itself are astronomical. And they're always they're not legitimized, but they're brushed off and normalized. So again, as a social entity, this is also something that is common practice. Yeah.
Maybe to go back to an earlier point, and that's for both for whoever wants to pick it up. Going back to this appearance of legality, I've been thinking about European colonial laws and statuses when Europe still had official colonies. And there was this idea of having citizens, a clear distinction between citizen and colonial subject. And that was a distinction that was drawn along racial lines with some exceptions. Of course, there's a temporal overlap between, say, British techniques of colonial governance and Israel itself. I'm just off the top of my head thinking of the repression of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, similar spatial sort of transforming villages into concentration camps, similar sort of repression on the basis of anti-terrorism and all of that. And now this vocabulary of colonial subject is clearly recognizable as obviously contrary to any sort of principle of equality. You kind of can't hide it. And so I've been thinking, and this is maybe a bit long and rambling, but I've been thinking that maybe in the case of Israel today, maybe we just don't have a similarly clear sort of vocabulary of legal statuses for Palestinians as far as international perception is concerned. We just don't know. We know that, okay, some Palestinians are citizens of Israel, but we don't really know what their status entails, and we don't have really words for it. So just thinking, is that something to work on as far as international perception of the situation is concerned?
Yeah, I think at the core and just the launching point, it is actually very, very clear. It's Jew and non-Jew. That's what the Israeli system acknowledges, just Jew, non-Jew, right? By law, by legislation, by policy. And I think this was crowned with the nation state law that makes it very, very clear that this is the Jewish state, and hence all rights, collective rights, come by merit, come by virtue of being Jewish. And in parallel to that, so what this means is it doesn't come to say, oh, this, look at land practice or urban development, right? They won't say this is money allocated or is not allocated to Arabs. They will say it's money allocated to Jews. And so by definition, as a Palestinian, as an Arab, you don't have access to that, to these resources. And that's inside the Green Line. In the West Bank, I think this separation, this reality is very clear when we look at Jewish settlers who enjoy rights as Israeli citizens in a land that is not their sovereign. And this is, looking through the prism of international law. Meanwhile, you have stateless subjects of military law. And earlier, Kristina asked me about what Palestinians inside the Green Line were subject to right after Nakba. And not many people are aware of the fact that between 1949 and 1966, Palestinians from, like myself, my communities were under martial law. We're subject to the same prototype of military rule that is now, enforced, albeit to such an extreme extent in the West Bank. And this is where these practices of segregation were actually birthed. We talk about prisons. We said, there's these mental prisons, but also physical prisons. Towns across both sides of the Green Line are concentration camps. They're unable to expand. I mentioned this, we spoke also about this. My town, for example, in 1948, it had 33,000 dunams. Dunam is the measure, it's 1,000 square meters. Israel took, based on its land ILA, they left us with 7,000. Of the 7,000, we're only designated 3,000 for urban planning, and the rest is agricultural. But back then, the residents of Kalansawa, my town, were only 2,500. Today, it's upward of 26,000. We remain in the same geographical places. And there's really a matrix of laws that point to this kind of segregation. But to go back to the crown of that is Jew and non-Jew, basically.
I think it's sufficient.
Okay. Then I will, at this point, thank you both, because we're also, I think, past the time that we promised we will keep inside in. And perhaps concerning the language, I would just try to finish up or emphasize what has been said. Let's listen to Palestinian prisoners. Let's hear them say that they're political prisoners. Let's not forget to write to resist the occupation. And yes, let's demand that political prisoners be free. Basil, Majd, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Kristina. Thank you, Majd.
يعطيك العافية
يعطيكم العافية. باي.
حبيبي.
شكرا. Thank you. Bye bye.